Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today well, we're taking a stack of history books, economic report, a ton of survivor memoirs, and we're trying to reverse engineer a monster. We're looking at the Soviet Union.
Right. But we aren't doing the standard high school history version. We're not just memorizing dates of battles or
Lists of general secretaries.
Exactly. We're trying to understand the life cycle of the USSR.
The mechanics of it, right?
Right.
Because when you really dig into the source material, you realize this wasn't just a country. It was an experiment, a massive, terrifying experiment to see if you could build a civilization on a foundation of total control.
And specifically on what we're calling the architecture of fear. That's the real through line in all these documents. The central idea is that the Soviet Union didn't just use fear, it was structurally reliant on it. The whole machine was fueled by the idea that mercy is weakness.
And like any machine, it has a fatal design flaw. It works great until the fuel runs out. So let's set the scene. 1917, I think the pop culture image of the Soviet Union is like Rocky IV, right? Drago. Endless tanks, this monolithic superpower.
Cold War boogeyman, yeah.
But the sources paint a completely different picture of the starting line. The Russia of 1917 isn't a superpower, it's a corpse.
It's a complete wreck. You have to understand the context of World War I here. The Romanov dynasty had been in charge for 300 years, and it didn't collapse because the peasants suddenly, read Karl Marx.
That's a huge misconception, isn't it?
Yeah.
The data just clears that up.
Yeah.
It wasn't some grand ideological epiphany. It was a hunger riot.
Exactly. The system physically broke. You had soldiers at the front fighting without boots. You had bread lines in Petrograd turning into riots. The breakdown was mechanical before it was ever political. The Romanovs fell because they just couldn't deliver the basic biological necessities of life.
And nature abhors a vacuum. So into this chaos steps Vladimir Lenin. And looking at his writings, at the accounts from the time, Lenin is fascinating because he is not a Democrat. He isn't running on hope and change.
No, not at all. Lenin is a realist of the most brutal kind. He looked at that chaos and realized the only way to harness it was through absolute discipline. He didn't promise freedom, he promised order and bread.
Right.
His core philosophy, and this is really the cornerstone of that architecture of fear, is that history is a war between classes. And in war, morality is a luxury you just can't afford.
So October 1917 hits. The Bolsheviks seize power. And I wanted to just double-click on that word seize. The sources are very clear. This wasn't a mass uprising where the whole country carried them into the Winter Palace on their shoulders.
No, it was a coup. It was a minority party, highly disciplined, using propaganda and targeted violence to take control of key infrastructure. Democracy died very, very quietly. But taking power is the easy part.
Right.
Holding it when the country is literally falling apart, that's where the nightmare really begins.
Which leads us directly to the Civil War from 1918 to 1921. And if you look at the casualty numbers, the descriptions of the fighting, it's basically hell on earth.
It is the USSR being born in blood, as one historian we read puts it. You have the Red Army versus the White Army, which was this loose coalition of royalists, Democrats, some foreign powers. But the deep dive here isn't about troop movements. It's about the tools Lenin authorized to win.
This is the birth of the Red Terror.
Yes. And terror wasn't an insult thrown by their enemies. It was official policy. Lenin established the Cheka, the secret police, and gave them carte blanche.
Yeah.
We're talking mass executions, labor camps, and something the sources really highlight, hostage taking.
That's a mafia tactic, basically.
It's binary. It's obey or disappear. If a village resisted giving up its grain, you didn't just arrest the leader, you took the families hostage.
And here's the dark lesson, the takeaway that shapes the next 70 years. They won. The Bolsheviks, despite being outnumbered in many ways, won the Civil War.
And that victory validated the method. That's the real tragedy here. The Soviet leadership learned that violence isn't just a side effect of war, it is a functional administrative tool. They learned that if you apply enough terror, you can bend reality to your will.
So Lenin establishes this foundation, but he dies in 1924. The machine is built, but it needs a new operator. And the Union chooses Joseph Stalin.
A pivotal moment. And again, we have to strip away the myth. People often picture dictators as these hypnotic, charismatic speakers. Yeah, like Hitler.
Yeah.
But the sources describe Stalin as, boring.
The gray blur, right? That was one of his nicknames.
Exactly. He wasn't a brilliant orator. He was a bureaucrat. But he was a bureaucrat of terror. He understood the filing cabinets. He knew where the bodies were buried because he was the one signing the burial orders.
The text describes him as patient, paranoid, and merciless.
And once he consolidated his power, he decided to do something that had never been done. He decided to rewrite the economic DNA of a massive country, basically overnight. This brings us to collectivization.
This is one of those events that is just so hard to wrap your head around conceptually. He essentially abolished private farming.
He declared war on his own peasantry. You have to realize, Russia was an agrarian society. Peasants had this deep connection to their land. Stalin viewed that independence as a threat. So he herded them into these collective farms, the kolkhozes, and seized their grain.
And then they resisted.
He engineered a famine. This is the Holodomor. The sources on this they're harrowing. We're talking about the state confiscating not just the grain, but the seed stocks for the next year, closing off borders so people couldn't flee the starving regions.
The statistics are just numbing. Millions dead, cannibalism, entire villages just erased from the map.
And this is where we get that quote attributed to Stalin, which essentially summarizes the entire Soviet experiment. One death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic.
It's sociopathic, but it's logical, if you're looking at it from within his framework. Individuals are just fuel for the state. If the engine needs fuel, you burn people.
Precisely. But then, in the 1930s, the architecture of fear undergoes a shift. During the Civil War and collectivization, the violence was directed at enemies, the whites, rich peasants, counter-revolutionaries. But under Stalin, in the 30s, the fear turns inward.
Great Purge.
Suddenly, the fear is for everyone. This is what really differentiates Stalinism from a standard dictatorship. He started purging his own party. Generals, scientists, the very people who helped build the revolution, nobody was safe.
The sources mention that evidence became irrelevant during this period. It wasn't about what you did, it was about meeting quotas.
It was the industrialization of paranoia. Police precincts literally had arrest quotas. Find 500 spies in this district. Well, if you can't find 500 spies, you just make them up. Because if you don't, you become the 501st.
That is just utterly terrifying. It's a snake eating its own tail.
It's the systematization of paranoia. The Gulag system, those frozen labor camps in Siberia, it expanded rapidly to accommodate all these new enemies. But the physical camps were only half the equation. The psychological impact is what really solidified the system.
Right, because if you can be arrested for nothing, how do you behave?
You become invisible. This created a specific psychological profile in the population, the Homo Sovieticus. To survive, you had to develop a kind of split personality. You had your public face, obedient, enthusiastic, parroting slogans. And then you had the private face, which you only showed to your spouse, maybe.
You learned to trust no one, to speak carefully, to remember nothing. Fear just became the atmosphere you breathed.
Exactly. It wasn't an event you were waiting for. It was the weather.
So you have a country that has just decimated its own military leadership, terrified its population, and is run by a man who sees shadows in every single corner. And then reality comes crashing in.
Yeah.
1941. Hitler invades.
Operation Barbarossa. And the irony is, for all his paranoia, Stalin didn't see it coming. He trusted the pact he'd signed with Germany.
He trusted the one person he absolutely shouldn't have, while killing everyone he should have trusted.
Exactly. And the Soviet Union almost collapsed in those first few months. The Germans were at the gates of Moscow.
But they didn't collapse. And this is the part of the deep dive where the scale just becomes impossible to visualize.
No.
The Eastern Front was the deadliest confrontation in human history.
The Soviet response was just desperate and absolute. Scorched earth, burn the fields, destroy the bridges, leave nothing for the enemy. And order number 227, not one step back. Retreat was punishable by execution, by your own troops.
Survival at any cost.
And they paid the cost. 27 million Soviet citizens dead.
27 million, that number. I mean, it just breaks your brain. It's more than the population of many countries today.
It is, but, and this is so crucial for understanding, the next 40 years, they won. They broke the Wehrmacht at Stalingrad, they took Berlin, and this victory gave the Soviet system the one thing it had always lacked, true legitimacy.
Right, it's the ultimate validation. We saved the world from fascism. And the dark irony is that saving the world from fascism gave the Soviet system the moral cover to tighten its grip even further. The victory justified all the suffering. It justified the terror. You could say, yes, we starved you, yes, we purged you, but look, we beat Hitler.
It proved the hard path was the right path, at least in their eyes.
Correct. And then the Iron Curtain comes down. We move into the Cold War. The fear goes global.
The USSR expands. Poland, East Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, they export the system. And whenever those populations tried to resist, like Hungary in '56 or the Prague Spring in '68,
the tanks rolled in. because the lesson from 1917 was still the operating manual. Violence works.
Exactly. But now, with nuclear weapons, that fear wasn't just internal anymore. It was mutual assured destruction. The architecture of fear became the architecture of the world.
A stalemate of terror.
So I want to just pause the timeline for a second here. We've talked about the terror, the gulags, the wars, but people still live their lives. The Soviet Union existed for decades after Stalin died in '53. What was that paradox of daily life like in the post-war Soviet Union?
This is fascinating, and it's really important to understand. If you look at the 60s and 70s, the overt terror had subsided a bit. People weren't being dragged out of their beds at night in the same numbers. There was a kind of social contract.
Sorry.
Right. The state says, we will give you a job, we will give you an apartment, we will give you free healthcare and education, you will never be unemployed.
Stability.
But the cost is your freedom. You have no political voice, you have no right to travel, and economically the reality was drab. Shortages were constant.
The bread lines, the empty shelves, you hear stories of people waiting 5 years for a car.
Or standing in line for 3 hours because a store might have shoes, even if they aren't your size. You buy them just to trade for something later.
Yeah, and the sources mentioned that people stayed compliant, not necessarily because they loved the system, but because the alternatives were simply invisible.
Information control. If you don't know that life is better in Paris or London, you just accept that a 2-hour line for sausages, well, it's just life. The propaganda was effective, but mostly, the system didn't need the people to love it. It only needed them to show up to work.
It's a transaction. You give us your agency, we give you basic survival.
Exactly. But here's the flaw in the machine. A system built on fear and total control is incredibly strong. Right up until the moment it isn't, it's brittle.
The rot sets in.
By the 1970s and 80s, the Soviet Union is exhausted. Economically, it's stagnating. Central planning just can't keep up with the complexity of a modern economy. Technologically, they are completely missing the computer revolution. Corruption is rotting the whole institution from the inside out.
And they're bogged down in their own Vietnam, the war in Afghanistan.
And this is where we meet the final main character of our story, Mikhail Gorbachev.
Now, Gorbachev is often misunderstood in the West. He wasn't a secret capitalist trying to bring down the wall, was he?
Not at all. He was a true believer. He was a product of the party. He wanted to save communism. He looked at the stagnation and said, we need to fix the engine.
So he introduces these two concepts that became famous worldwide, Glasnost and Perestroika.
Openness and restructuring. His theory was, if we let people criticize the corruption, that's Glasnost, we can identify the problems. And if we restructure the economy, Perestroika, to allow a little market competition, we can make the system efficient again.
He thought he could have communism with a human face.
But it was a fatal miscalculation. He didn't realize that the system was held together by the silence. The fear was the load-bearing wall.
Like pulling a loose thread on a sweater. He thought he was just fixing a little hem and the whole thing just unraveled.
That is the perfect analogy. Once Glasnost allowed people to speak, they didn't just complain about corrupt mayors or inefficient factories. They started asking fundamental questions. Why did my grandfather die in the Gulag? Why is Estonia part of this union? Why are we poor?
And because Gorbachev had renounced the use of mass violence, he wasn't willing to be another Stalin. The fear just evaporated.
And without fear, the Soviet Union had no gravity. It couldn't hold its orbit. The satellite states in Eastern Europe broke away first, and then the rot reached the core.
So we get to 1991. And for such a violent, bloody empire, an empire born in a civil war that killed millions, the end was so shockingly quiet.
That is the most surprising data point in this whole deep dive. The collapse wasn't a nuclear apocalypse, it was a resignation.
The empire dissolved under its own weight.
Republics declared independence. The hardliners tried a coup, but it failed because the soldiers just wouldn't shoot the people anymore. The mechanism of fear was broken, and on Christmas Day in 1991, the red flag came down over the Kremlin. It just stopped.
So let's zoom out. What's the final takeaway from this life cycle? We've gone from a revolution born in hunger to a superpower built on statistics of death to a quiet collapse when the fear finally lifted.
It's a tragic arc. The USSR failed economically. It couldn't feed its people. It failed morally, obviously. But we do have to acknowledge its legacy. It proved that ideology can mobilize millions of people to do impossible things, like industrialize a peasant nation in a decade or defeat the Nazi war machine.
But it also proved that you can replace freedom with control, but only temporarily.
That's the key word, temporarily. That is the final thought here, I think. You can build an architecture of fear. You can build walls and secret police and information blackouts, and that system can survive for a long time. 70 years is a human lifetime, but you're fighting gravity.
Because it relies on suppressing basic human nature.
The desire to speak, to trust, to choose. You can suppress that, but you can't extinguish it. The moment you lift the boot from someone's neck, the grass grows back. The Soviet Union was a structure built on sand.
The Union is gone, but the shadow it cast in geopolitics, in the borders of Europe, and in the minds of the people who lived through it, that remains.
Absolutely. The map changed, but the scars are still there.
A heavy but necessary deep dive today.
Yeah.
Thank you for walking us through the machinery of it all.
My pleasure.
And thank you for listening. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.